Yes, my brain is not here today, you guys.
We're going to do great, everybody.
Very patient.
I believe in us.
Okay. Welcome to SnarkSquad Pod, the media podcast where we probably don't recognize that very famous character. I'm Nicole Sweeney.
My name is Marines.
And we are joined again by our dear friend and snark lady, Sam. Say hello, reintroduce yourself to the good people of the podcast.
Hey guys, it's me, Sam, aka Democracy Diva, and I'm thrilled to be back on the SnarkSquad Pod.
Sam is back again because we are once again revisiting George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. We are now on the second book, A Clash of Kings. And I forgot to remind Sam that this was coming, but I'm going to throw it back over to her for some attempt at a plot synopsis.
That's great. I anticipated this about 15 seconds ago. So I opened a Wikipedia page, and it's not going to be helpful. So let's see how this goes. We're picking up from the end of book 1 of A Game of Thrones. Basically, now that Ned is dead, things are getting crazy in the war, what will be called the War of the Five Kings, although there are not actually 5 kings yet. The Night's Watch is going north of the Wall to figure out what all the wildlings are up to, and Dany had some dragons, so that's a big deal. So that's where the book starts. We kind of track different threads of, Bran in Winterfell meeting the Reeds, and eventually Theon coming in and making a mess of that. We get our first glimpse of Dragonstone, where King Stannis is doing crazy shit over there, and also crowning himself, and also his brother Renly crowns himself, and we deal with their fight. In King's Landing, we've got Tyrion as acting Hand of the King, trying to just kind of get the city together, and Arya is still wandering around, ideally making it to the Wall, but of course that never happens. And that's most of the threads that we follow, besides Dany, who goes on her own sort of like weird journey through the wilderness and getting like weird LSD visions. And yeah, Jon goes beyond the Wall and ends up having to get a little closer to the wildlings than he intended. And we have a giant, huge-ass battle at the end called the Battle of the Blackwater. And if you watched season 2 of A Game of Thrones, you pretty much know what I'm talking about. So hopefully I hit most of the high points. Yeah. We also meet Brienne of Tarth. I feel that that's important enough to say.
Yes.
And that's my summary.
Obviously.
That's my summary.
Yeah, that's an impressive summary. I mean, there's like 1,000 ways you could take the idea of summarizing this 800-page book. So, but I think that's a pretty effective way to distill all of this down. So usually the thing that we do, now that the summary is out of the way, is get into the just basic, did you enjoy this? And I feel like I have to offer a caveat to my answer to this question, which is that getting through this was more difficult than getting through the first one. Is it longer? I don't know. It felt longer. Maybe I enjoyed it. I will probably mention a time or 20 throughout this conversation how much I had to rush through it in order to finish it in time to record this podcast. We, in fact, pushed back the recording of this podcast a couple hours from when we originally intended. And there were parts of it that I mentioned this before we started recording, but for example, Dany's LSD visions, that chapter, I was trying to clean. I moved this weekend and I was trying to clean my stuff, clean and pack and whatever, while that chapter was being read to me at 3 times speed. And I kept having to stop, be like, wait, what the fuck is going on? I have no idea. I cannot track one sentence to the next. So all of that's to say, very long-winded way of saying that I probably maybe enjoyed it, but it's hard for me to even go so far as to say that because most of this experience is still mired in this was so much effort reading it was effort more than it was like enjoyable, if that makes sense.
I had a pretty similar experience, and I think I'm trying to think back if we've ever really talked about this in so many words, but one of the things that I find most interesting about consuming media and about reading specifically is how you bring not only like your biases of like your worldview and things like that to a story, but just the environment that you read it in. So what's going on in your life? What did you read before it or after it? And how those kinds of things can inform your reading experience. And this reading experience was similarly for me informed by a rush to get through it. And that is literally nobody's fault but my own. We
Yes.
know,
Oh, yes,
we
yes.
have known that we had this coming up. And I was like, yeah, I'll just read a bunch of it like on vacation. I read none of it on vacation. And I got back this week or last Monday and went straight back to work. So it's been kind of a wild week for me too. And I had to read pretty much 700 pages in the last 2 days. And the end, I got through all of it. I'm counting this as read. I skimmed a lot of the end there just to make it on time here, and there was one Theon chapter that I outright skipped because I was like, you know what, fuck this, I don't want to read it. I have so much reading left to do, and I just like skipped that entire chapter. So
there's like an 80% chance you didn't miss anything but blowjobs, so you're fine.
Right. It was at the point there was some nudity mentioned, and that was when I was like, you know what, I hate this character, I hate this portion of his story, and I'm out. So that's my admission there. But yes, it was a rush. It was kind of a speed reading job here, but I'm sure this is going to be still a really great conversation. Question mark.
We're super optimistic. I mean, it's easier for me to say that I liked it because I'm reading it for like the 7th time. So if I didn't like it, this would just be, really sad by now.
Yeah. You either like the book or like really deeply hate yourself. Basically.
Right. And some days it's both. I'm complex that way.
Sure.
But I have a great time with this book. I hate the Theon of this book, but I understand why it's here. So it has some of my least favorite things, like all of Theon.
All of Theon.
But it also has, the House of the Undying is one of my favorite chapters in the whole series. John, when John has to, decide that he has to kill Corin Halfhand in order and join the Wildlings. I love that chapter. And I love the comet at the end. I love the whole beginning of this book. I love the prologue, and I love the placement of the comet in like the first many, many, many chapters in all different locations to kind of tie everybody back together. So it does have some elements that I super duper love. And we meet some really interesting characters for the first time, like everybody in Stannis' circle, really. And it might be my favorite Tyrion arc of the whole series, because I think watching him be political in King's Landing before nobody lets him do anything anymore is super duper fun. It's certainly when he's having the most fun in all of the books, and so I'm having the most fun with him in all of the books, I would say.
I will say that I was really surprised, not only because I was rushing, but at how, for as dense as this is and for as many little moments where I was like, okay, George, we get it. And he was kind of being repetitive and, descriptive as he tends to be. I found this a pretty easy reading experience. And even though I mostly knew what was happening because of spoilers in the books or whatever, I found myself engrossed all the time, even knowing the outcome. So there wasn't stuff here that was necessarily unenjoyable for out of story reasons for me. A lot of it was cringeworthy for in story reasons, like knowing what was coming in the future and my precious babies. But I found this pretty easy to read for me personally and enjoyable in the sense of like enjoying the story, even though it's like grim and dark and everything is going bad.
Yeah, I think I mostly agree with that. The Theon chapters were hard enough to read that I have mixed emotions about how much I can say that the difficulty of reading them is explicitly in story and intentional. I'm on the fence about that specifically. Like, I think, I don't know, it was just, those parts were far and away the worst. Like, literally every time I saw his name pop up at the chapter header, I was unhappy. And I knew I was going to continue to be very unhappy for like the next 20 whatever minutes. So that, I don't know. I'm unclear, but I would agree that for the most part, the rest of it I found deeply engrossing, and I wanted to know what happened. I guess that's what I mean too. Like with the Theon stuff, like I didn't even fucking want to know what happened. Like I don't care. Like I don't like skip it, delete it. Bye. Is how I felt about every Theon chapter. I mentioned this in the last podcast, or the last A Song of Ice and Fire podcast, that I was surprised last time by just how much I loved Dany because of how ambivalent I have come to be about her character on the show. And that was like not as surprising now, but like, again, that's the thing that I keep being struck by. And it occurred to me this time around that part of what it is that unlike a lot of my other favorites who I love and I like want them to succeed, but I know so much sadness is still waiting for them, they're like making a lot of very stupid decisions that are facilitating the sadness that is waiting for them. Whereas so far, I feel like I get all of Dany's choices, you know, like the things that are bad that happen to her mostly come from this place of like shit happens or like whatever. But I get it. I get what she's doing. Whereas a number of members of the Stark family just keep doing things that are so frustrating, which brings me to the thing that I most want to discuss, which is Arya having 3 names and none of them being Tywin. This is the thing that gave me the most feelings. I spent like basically like half the book, right? I like listening to it on audiobook, like all digital formats. I lose all sense of placement, like where I am in the book. But I think it's like a sizable chunk of the book that she has these names and she like deliberates over what to do with them. And like, I don't know how much of this is having the future knowledge that like reading it and being like, God damn it, you could have prevented all of it.
That moment, I kept thinking about it in terms of there's this moment in Chamber of Secrets, the second Harry Potter book, where they're getting ready to go to school. And it's the year that they take the car, like the enchanted car, I believe. So they're all in the car, they're packed away. And then Ginny goes, oh no, I forgot my journal. And they turn back around and go get the haunted journal, like Lord Voldemort's journal. And it's like that one instant where you're like, oh my God, that whole thing almost didn't happen. Like had she just left the journal at home. And this is like that moment in the A Song of Ice and Fire universe where like had she just given the name of Tywin Lannister, like how much different could things have happened? But I think it's very kind of representative of a lot of what's going on in this book. And it's like the short-sightedness of some characters compared to the long haul of like the big wars happening. And yes. Arya herself has that moment where she's like, oh my God, she's so engrossed in the people who are affecting her in the short term, like the people who are, you know, and I get it because they're like physically abusing her.
And because she's 9 years old.
Like, right. She's got this like short-sightedness. And even the fact that she realizes that halfway through, like I had 3 names and I could have said all of these other people, but I just couldn't see that far. Like, I think that speaks to a lot of what's playing out on the larger field of this story from Arya, who is 9 or however she is, to some of these self-proclaimed Keens who are not seeing the bigger picture here. And then that plays into the whole like magic coming back and, you know, Osha in the background being like, hello, you're marching the wrong way, because the real big picture here is, you know, like zombies. So, right. Yeah. Her little like segue at Harrenhal, I think is like speaks a lot to what's happening big picture here.
Yeah, totally. And I just want to clarify, I'm picking on Arya, but like unfairly, because relative to a lot of other people, like it's just this one thing. Most of her decisions make a lot of sense. I get it. And I even get this again from the perspective of like, yes, she's a child literally being abused by all of these people. Like I get it. I do. But also why?
Right. I think there's totally room for us to be like, I want to die watching this happen and knowing she's not saying Tywin while simultaneously recognizing, like, that's the point. She's a child. She's going for the people who are impacting her day-to-day life the most because she can't think much bigger than that. And I do definitely agree that there's something to that theme that is reflected in the whole, like, oh, you're all only caring about who's king of Westeros and not that all the zombies are going to kill us. Like, Arya can only think about her day-to-day and not her overarching Night's King, which is Tywin Lannister.
Right.
For as much as, for as big a blood and booby budget as HBO had, and as faithful to the story as it was, especially in the beginning and in certain aspects it is, I feel like there is a physical brutality, or like the abuse that Arya and Sansa go through in this book, physical abuse, we don't see a lot of it in the show.
Correct.
I think there's the one scene where Sansa, she starts to get beat and undressed, and that's kind of it that we see very briefly. And I understand why, especially using kid actors.
We see the slaps. We see a number of the slaps, and like that she's being hit every time she annoys Joffrey, and like that it's mentioned that Cersei told him to never hit her, which is also like, even on the show, that like that is played as this moment of like, hey, there's Cersei is telling him this from a place that is personal. So
right,
there's a little bit more of it, but sorry, I
just felt like it was so much more like in your face in the book in a way that I kind of didn't expect, and it really put me in mind to, like, as of all like the bad stuff that is happening, there is a sense that at least at the very beginning, Arya and Sansa really got the worst end of the stick of the Stark children. By the end, when Winterfell is like burned down, things are really rough looking for all of them. But just because of being in King's Landing, like Arya and Sansa are really going through some shit at the beginning of this book. And I don't know, it was just kind of like more in your face reading it than I ever experienced in the TV show.
Yeah, I agree. I think we don't always consider the show being like restrained and holding back because it really doesn't do that a lot of the time. But there are some things that, like, yeah, they're just not going to show as much of it on television as we get in these books, which is probably a good thing, but also, yeah, makes your first read of the books after coming off the show probably a lot more intense than you would expect it to be.
Nicole, you mentioned that Dany has kind of been your favorite, like maybe not favorite point of view, but kind of the one that sticks out to you as like enjoying her character more in the book. I've already mentioned that Theon is far and away my least favorite point of view to read from, but I'm doing a flip-flop here because I'm pretty sure in the first episode I said that Catelyn was my least favorite, and she had some of my favorite scenes this book.
Oh, good.
I wrote this down. Yes, I wrote this down as well.
I was hoping you were going to have a Catelyn change of heart because of this book, so I'm really glad to hear that.
I don't know what, first of all of her grief for Ned, it was just heartbreaking to me, all of her grief for her children, all of her thoughts about her children, and just her thinking about being pulled all of these, 5 different ways to protect her kids. And then she's so like wise, and she's trying to counsel. And there was just so much there that I really enjoyed. And I enjoyed all of her movements, where I really didn't really care about what was happening at Harrenhal. It was really just like a sidebar. Dany was having a bunch of sidebars. All of Caitlyn's movements I was really interested in. Like, I wanted to see the standoff between Renly and Stannis, and everything she was doing I was really enjoying. Plus her point of view really grew on me. Like, I guess I can stop hounding on the fact that she was so mean to Jon Snow. That was really what ruined the first book for me, but she really grew on me, and her point of view chapters I think were my favorite in this book.
Yeah, I wrote down, I know this was like somewhere in the middle. This is long before she's heard that Bran and Rickon are are presumed dead. I don't even remember why I wrote this down, but I wrote down Catelyn sobbing. But I feel like this was often a thing. In part, again, she's super wise, and like going back to this thing of like how much you understand why everyone is doing things, and she was definitely a character that like everything about where she was coming from made sense. And it was also a bit of like, Rob, listen to your mother, please. And that whole component of it. And I think even her, I don't know, her cruelty to John too is a thing that, especially now, or I don't know, like it's a thing that just makes so much sense to me. Like not that it like justifies it or excuses it, but I think that so much of like being inside her head in this book, especially, I was like, I get you. Like, I don't know. I just deeply empathize with you, and I understand where you are coming from and why. Like, she has a whole long. I mean, she talks about doing her duty a lot, but there's one chapter in particular. Maybe this is the one that made me sob. I don't know. But where she talks at like considerable length about like her whole lifetime of doing her duty. And so and like that especially, you're like, yeah, like I get it. Like this daily reminder of this slight when like you did your duty again and again. And like all you could ask of your fucking husband is that he like not like betray you in like this very major way and whatever. I don't know. I just, yeah, Catelyn chapters were great.
I love reading Catelyn in this book. First of all, the amount of Red Wedding foreshadowing and end of book 3 foreshadowing you get in the chapters is brilliant. She talks about having the face of a drowned woman. She talks about drowning in her grief. She says, when they took Ned's head off, they killed me too. You get like over and over again all this imagery pounded into your head of Catelyn like literally dying and drowning in her grief. And like, that's only a book away. So yay, the saddest yay ever. But you know that my favorite thing to do is just yell foreshadowing. So I want to take the opportunity to do that here. I'm also glad you brought up how enjoyable it was to watch Kat's movements and the Renly and Stannis stuff, because I love that we get the Renly and Stannis standoff through Catelyn's perspective. I think the mother's perspective on these two idiot brothers who just can't get along and are going to both like die because they can't just work their shit out. I think getting that from a detached mother's perspective is brilliant and really, I just feel like it shows you such a different side of Renly and Stannis than you would get if you only are seeing the standoff from like, I don't know, Brienne or Davos or somebody like that, as opposed to getting a perspective that is either super pro Renly or super pro Stannis. You get Catelyn being like, can both of you just grow up and stop your bullshit and pull it together? And I think that's phenomenal.
Which ties back to what both of you guys were saying at the outset of this conversation, which is that like so much of this book is about that, like of like missing, you know, people being so focused on like immediate enmities that they're missing the bigger picture. And so like using Catelyn to tell that particular story is like that's the way that you frame that story, in the same way that so many of these other stories like ultimately are framed.
I was going to say the same thing, and I think two moments stand out to me as kind of being like thesis moments, and one of them comes via Catelyn, and I think it's when she's praying right before the showdown between these two, and she's praying to the seven gods, and I think she prays, I can't remember if it's to the mother or to whatever the warrior god is, but she basically says that, you know, to watch over for the people who are going to lose loved ones, because there are going to be mothers out there missing their sons and their children. And so she just brings a very human aspect to this idea of like these big wars and the kings fighting for the throne. But she grounds it again in like, these are just two idiot brothers. And then also like the human scale of like the loss and you know, what is actually at stake. And then the other moment is in King's Landing when people are throwing shit at Joffrey, which has to be one of my favorite moments ever.
Relatable, most relatable moment.
there is this moment where the people are like shouting in the riot, and some are shouting Renly and Stannis and Rob, and then they all just start shouting bread because they're hungry. And I'm also like, yeah, relatable. It's another moment where it pulls it into a very human thing where all of these guys are playing out their politics and, you know, all of that, but there are mothers losing sons and there are hungry people who need bread, and, you know, that's kind of playing in the background of this big war of kings.
Can I talk about the Cobbit for a little bit?
Yes.
I'm going to talk about my favorite character in this book, which is a Cobbit. So I just love the mechanic in general. I think bringing all these very, very disparate stories together through something that they can all see in the sky is just a cool idea. I think that's just great. We saw it at the end of the last book. We saw it the night that Dany's dragons were born. So, like, we all are aware that, like, if this comet is anybody's, it's probably Dany's. But the people in the story don't know that. And it's so great to hear each city and town and person have their own take on it, but for so many of them to be threaded together in similar ways. So, like, almost every single one of what people describe this comet to be have to do with either fire or blood. And the Targaryen words are fire and blood. So, like, I think that's super fucking clever. And, you know, the more intelligent a character is, or the more, like, trustworthy they are in story, like, the better understanding they have of this comet. Like, you know that dumb people are going to be like, it's King Joffrey's comet. Come to, you know, light his path to victory. And Sansa's like, no, it fucking isn't. But then you'll get, you know, Kat's uncle Brynden, who, like, is someone we know is wise, being like, that's blood smeared across the sky, and it's everybody's blood because everybody, you know, both sides die in war. And so it's interesting.
Legit.
And we're like, the Blackfish is legit and know what's up. So, like, we can trust him on that. Whether he's right or not, you know, he has a description of the comet that, like, is a little bit closer to the truth, you know, as opposed to Theon, who, like, thinks it's his blowjob comet, and we're like, that's not a thing, buddy. I hate to disappoint you, Theon, but this comet is not just for you and your dick, and you're the worst. And oh my god, watching him just, like, in the middle of this sex scene being like, yeah, it's my comet, I'm like, you're the worst person.
Yes. Yes, I didn't read any of that. That was literally what I skipped.
I told you that was all you missed, and I was 100% correct. So that's what you missed. Theon gets a blowjob and thinks the comet is his now because he's the worst. Cool. I didn't intend this to be a rant about Theon, but, you know, listen, a lot of what makes his later chapters so good is the juxtaposition to what a dipshit he is now. So, like, I will at some point in the future appreciate all of this because it, you know, forms everything that you get out of him in the end. But God, reading that chapter is the absolute worst.
I am down with being loud and wrong, and I'm just gonna if that's what I'm about to do, that's fine. But I cannot foresee a time where I will ever be happy about all the stupid fucking Theon chapters I had to read.
I mean, that's fair. You won't be. Like,
I know what's coming. I mean, I don't, like, obviously, you know, there's divergences in the books, whatever. I know very bad things are coming to Theon, but God, I hate him. I hate him so, like, I can't even be sad for him, but all the very bad things that are coming because I hate him so much.
Okay,
so.
And instead, just think about how much of his sister Asha we're going to get, and that will be better.
Okay, yes, that's true.
That's a really good way of getting you through this. Is just being like, okay, eventually we get to see Asha being amazing, so, like, let's just struggle through, and that'll be worth it.
Even though her introduction of her, like, touching her brother's dick was like not my favorite thing in the world. But
not my favorite.
I mean, certainly not relatable, but
in less relatable content,
right?
We talked about when we were talking about the first book, like the balance of this story being a fantasy because it had those magical elements, but starting as being kind of devoid of magic and all of these people playing their political games without realizing like what's kind of north of the wall. And then at the end of the book, the dragons are born. So I really like the comment and they even reference it as so when you have like the people making the wildfire, fire, like, any dragons around or something? Because this is suddenly easy. And Tyrion's like, no. So there's a lot of like this foreshadowing of like, no, of course magic's not around, but it's the comet in the sky to me is saying like, like magic's back again, right? It's born. It comes when Dany's dragons are born. So I think it's like this. I love that it's like this introduction of like, okay, you thought you were getting this political war kind of thing, and you are in a lot of aspects, but we're really getting deeper and deeper into the magic. You get the dragon glass for the first time this book, and there's so much of that is like being like threaded in, and I loved it so much.
We had the dragon glass in the last book because it was one of Sam's favorite moments. One of the moments that Sam got really excited about was when they dropped all the dragon glass.
Oh yeah, that does sound like me.
I don't actually remember reading that so much as I remember editing that part of the podcast.
See, guys, I'm just getting you all the stuff you missed.
And this one, it's Jon finding all of the dragon glass buried, and I guess Ghost leads him to it. And now that I mentioned Ghost, anytime a direwolf I'm reading about it, I'm like, wolves.
Yes.
And I love that we get so much more warging stuff.
Yeah.
Because in the show, and I'm always the one that's bringing up the show, like, sorry, not sorry.
I feel like I'm doing it constantly, so that's fine.
I think we've correct me if I'm wrong, it's been so long now, but we've only really seen Bran warg, right? But we get to know that more Jon is a warg in the books as well. So there's like so much more going on there that I really appreciate.
Just in general, the fact that there is so much more magic is a thing that I'm super into. That is a thing that I'm very much enjoying. It's not a thing that like I look at with any sort of, I don't know, like I get it from like for the adaptation. Like I get that when you're simplifying down that like the magic is an easy thing to simplify out. So like I get it, but it's a thing that I am enjoying about this experience for sure.
Yeah. And I think it's also like the warging scenes are written in such a sensory fashion that like there is no translation for that.
Right.
Even if you're looking out of the eyes of a wolf, like the smells are what make you know that you're in a wolf scene. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Like once they start smelling everything, then you're like, oh, right, this is a wolf and not Bran or Jon or Arya or whatever the case may be. So, like, yeah, I get that there is no way to adapt that in a really effective way because so much of that scene is, like, you know, them, like, sensing blood and smelling things and, like, having hunger and, like, just sensory experiences that you can't get through a screen.
You would effectively have to add more. The thing is, like, in order to, like, you would have to add additional scenes of, like, explanation that, like, now what you are seeing is Jon's dream, you know,
right.
like, and it's just like unnecessary when like you can communicate all the information, like Ghost learns a thing, like the show does convey that like Jon and Ghost can communicate a little bit, whatever. Like there are just so many shortcuts around it that it's basically they were like, we only need Bran to be able to do this. It's necessary that we introduce this idea for Bran, but for everyone else,
right.
I was super aware in this book also, probably because my heart was just aching for Arya and Sansa the whole time, as I have already mentioned, but they are the two that are without their dire wolves in this book. We get mention of Nymeria briefly and kind of alluded to maybe that Arya came across the pack that Nymeria might be leading out in the wild, but for the most part, you know, you get a mention of the other three with their dire wolves and calling to them and being in the same area. So it was really stark contrast to me to know that Sansa and Arya are without their direwolves. And the direwolves in general, like some of my favorite symbolism to talk about. And even it doesn't mean anything, like I'm trying to extrapolate all of this meaning from them. And you know, you have Lady, the lady, and then Nymeria, the warrior. And I think that it was especially heartbreaking because when Sansa and Arya go to King's Landing, there's a little taste of those two things that I think that they get, the lady's life and the warrior's life. And this book is really about bringing all of that down. And the parts where Arya's thinking like, I'm not a warrior, I'm not a knight, I'm not a water dancer, I'm just a mouse. I'm just like, oh, poor baby. And I think that's so symbolized in the loss of her Nymeria, just like it's symbolized in the loss of Sansa's lady. So I don't know. I just had all kinds of direwolf feelings this book as well.
Yes. Speaking of Sansa and Arya, some of this is just like me and like things that I am looking for. It's just like in general, I have so many endless feelings for like sibling relationships, whatever. So anytime Sansa or Arya thought about each other, it was
my favorite.
They each had like the same. It's like the same stock thought. Honestly, this is the way that the Stark children think about each other is a thing that I find wanting in the writing of this. There is like a stock thought that each of them has about the other.
Right.
It is like not very nuanced.
Right. John mussed up my hair, and then we said a word at the same time.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Totally. It's the same fucking thing over and over again. But I do not care. I was so excited for it every time it happened, just from a like personal level of, look, the siblings are thinking about each other.
Yeah.
There was that one little moment that I thought was sweet where Arya was like, I'll even beg pardon from Sansa, like a real lady. She'll love that. And
Yeah, I love that line.
Oh, no. Yeah.
There were actually also Arya had another thought too about that, I guess, slightly more like, I don't know, interesting and like thinking about Sansa as beyond just like the immediate thought, still in the same vein of thoughts, but thinking that Sansa would know the names of the people that had arrived, like that.
Yes.
That I thought that was like slightly more interesting and like, oh yes, I don't know, slightly more there. Also, in the way of sibling things that I thought was interesting, Dany thinking about Viserys and what turned him so douchey was really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Like I don't know how much of that is just that, you know, she is his, like she's his sister, like this is her thinking about her brother. And it kind of reminds me of very different, but when we were talking about Loki and Thor and how, you know, like you're tracking Loki's story through Thor. And so like continuing to believe in Loki, like obviously, of course, Thor is going to do this because it's his brother and whatever. And so obviously some of that is part of what's going on with Dany trying to empathize with and understand the man that Viserys was at the time that he died. I don't know. It was just interesting for her to sort of like think through, like, yeah, like having to go around begging people for something that otherwise you believe and is yours by right and whatever, and like, but to have to beg for it constantly, and just that her thinking about that and his life and whatever was very interesting.
I think another very interesting sibling dynamic that we see in this book is Tyrion and Cersei.
Oh yeah,
and them like kind of manipulating each other and kind of going around each other. I thought was Sam already mentioned, Tyrion's whole, just everything that he does while in King's Landing, I think was super interesting to watch, and just him thinking through and being more thoughtful, but then Cersei kind of playing in the background. But there is especially that one moment. There's like also other feelings there that we don't get addressed outrightly all the time, but you know that it's very loaded. So even the moment where Cersei kisses him on his forehead and it really takes him aback, and there's like a moment where you're thinking like, oh my God, like it really, it was like, it touched him almost, because he's like, I can't remember the last time he did it. But then he ends it with like, she's planning something, follow that bitch, basically. Yeah. So you're like, you know, their sibling dynamic, like there is some underlying feeling there, but at this point they're just basically manipulating each other back and forth all through the story.
Yeah, I just get a real joy out of watching like Tyrion in his element, just like attempting to outmaneuver his sister, you know, knowing that he's smarter than she is, but that she's more powerful than he is, and how that makes them act around each other, and, you know, how those puzzle pieces fit together is always great to me. And you know, it's really the one book where you get both of them in King's Landing in power, without Jaime there, without Tywin there. It like really is just them two. And so you do get, you know, the clearest vision of their sibling relationship, the way they think and think around each other. I don't know. It just, that kind of endlessly fascinates me.
And Cersei is always acting, with the thoughts of her children at the forefront. And for the most part, you feel like Tyrion is trying to do the best he can for the kingdom. But there's also this moment that he confesses that he, as, this, how he sees himself, or with, being a dwarf and all of that, without the Lannister name, he's really nothing. So he's also acting in favor of his family in certain ways. So it's a very complicated dance between them two. And I just loved reading about it as much as I love watching the actors in the TV show do that as well. So I don't know. I just found that endlessly entertaining.
That is really interesting that you bring up the actors in the show too. I didn't think about it in quite that context, but yes, it was interesting how much of that really is there on the page. It is a thing that I think all of their scenes on the show are always fantastic because both of them are, Lena Headey especially, is just I just want to watch her anything. I don't care. I'll watch it. I whatever. And their scenes have this sort of it's just magnetic. And it was interesting to see that it felt that way on the page as well without everything that those actors bring to the table.
Right. I don't know if it's that those scenes on the show are better because they're taken straight from the books, or they're able to be better because those actors are the only ones who can bring the straight from the book scenes to life in that way. It's like everybody were firing on all cylinders in those scenes. Right. You get straight, these scenes pulled straight out of the book and the actors blowing it out of the water to the point that I'm reading and envisioning them in my head, which I don't do for a lot of people in this story, which might be surprising considering how overwhelmingly important the show is in pop culture and my slice of the internet. But there's a lot of people that I just don't envision as the show version of them because it doesn't add anything. And with those two, it's just they could not have done any better than Lena Headey and Peter Dinklage. So
wait, I now want to discuss this. Who are the people that you don't envision? Some of them.
It's hard for me to reconcile the way better and way younger Dany on the page with the Dany in the show.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess because all the kids are so much younger, it's easier for me to have a distance between them in the books and them on the show. I guess I still do envision them, but season 1, episode 1 version of them, yes, before they all hit puberty during filming. So for me, it's mostly just the very exceptional actors who I actually envision in my head while I'm reading. It's them and Brendan Blackfish because he's amazing. And I super duper love him.
I have another question for you as the resident expert on this. There was a big chunk of time where I didn't, I read the beginning and then I didn't read for a while. And one of my first notes is something that I thought I wrote down that it was interesting and I don't remember what it was. So I would now if you can, to explain to me again the story of the forging of Lightbringer / the Azor Ahai story. I wrote down that I thought that this was interesting and I clearly wanted to discuss it on the podcast.
Okay, that's hilarious and amazing. Yes, I am fully equipped to talk about Lightbringer. So the essential story is many moons ago, there was a guy who needed to be a hero and defeat I think we're lucky I just reread this part a couple days ago because it's fresh in my mind. I think it's a scene with Davos, our Onion Knight, and Salador San, the pirate.
Right.
And Salador is telling...
Coming back to me.
And Salador tells him, oh, that fucking glowing sword Stannis was holding, I hope you don't really think that's Lightbringer, because it better not be Lightbringer, because here's the story of how Lightbringer was forged. So he talks about it being a time after a long summer when darkness fell heavy on the world, or something like that. That makes you be oh, that kind of sounds like now. Just enough that you're yeah, that does sound like now. But the point was, he needed a special sword to, I guess, defeat the others. And so this hero, labors like 40 days trying to make this sword, and he tries to temper it and it breaks. And he's like, okay, and then he tries again, and he tries for like 3 months to like hammer this sword every night, and he like tempers it with like the blood of a lion, which I'm like, is that supposed to be important in a Lannister way? I don't know. I haven't figured that out yet, but like the point is that doesn't work either. So finally he like works on the third sword for like 1 billion days or whatever it is, but for some unbeknownst reason, he decides that there's a certain way to temper this to make it work. And so he calls his wife over to him and is like, hey, I love you. And then he stabs her through the chest with the sword. And that's the forging of Lightbringer. And all of her like innocence and wonder and like ecstasy and like life power went into the sword. And then he used that sword to defeat the others. So I guess the important part of this is it being like the sacrifice of an innocent is the only reason that this powerful sword exists. And so that can foreshadow a lot of things that we've seen in the show and are maybe to come in the books but have not happened yet. I mean, I don't know why I'm being coy, but like, but Stannis killing his daughter is obviously a pretty, direct link to Azor Ahai killing his wife to forge Lightbringer. And there's other stuff mostly throughout Stannis' arc that is this very question of like, if you have to do a bad thing to one person to save the whole world, how bad is that? That's something that's constantly getting weighed between him and Renly and him and Robert's bastard and on the show, him and Shireen. So that is the forging of Lightbringer. And I'm glad you find it interesting, because so do I.
I think now that you have started talking, I think that I mostly wrote it down because I wanted to hear your foreshadowing thoughts.
That's my favorite thing to do.
Yeah.
I thought about the connection with Shireen as well after he kind of gave the story. But the other thing that I really thought about is that, the Red Lady has been kind of stringing him along with all of these, like, this big talk, and we see it starting now about the Lord of Light and him being kind of this hero reborn, and he's got Lightbringer. But the first thing we hear is that rings false because he didn't actually bring the sword about in the correct way, and he caught on fire kind of when he did the whole thing. Really like hit me, because in the end, the spoilers again, we're not being coy here, but Stannis dies, and it's clear that he's not like this foreshadowed hero. He doesn't get the Iron Throne. Like his end is an end. So the fact that we see right from the outset that things are not going well for him, and they're just kind of like cheating, like the Red Lady is like cheating him into this kind of like hero position, was kind of a thing where I was like, oh bro, man, maybe when you caught on fire you should have realized.
I have a ton to say about this that I can't say yet, but when we get to future books I want to talk about this again, because there are a lot of characters in universe who acknowledge this same exact thing.
Okay, awesome. Put a pin in that.
Okay. Good. I love when the characters in the book acknowledge the things that I'm thinking.
Yeah.
It's very satisfying.
Anyone want to talk about the Blackwater? Or was that so close to the end that everybody skimmed it?
I'm like, let's do it. Let's see what I can remember from episode 9, season 2.
I mean, I actually don't have a ton to say about it that, like, you can't say equally, and we haven't said equally about the way the show portrayed it, because it is a phenomenal episode of television, and like still remains one of the best all these seasons later.
Yeah.
But I just love the way we get the perspectives on it. I love that you have Davos on the river dealing with the wildfire. You have Tyrion like on the ground in the city, like dealing with kind of the ground troops, and you have Sansa, the princess in the tower, as removed and protected as she can be, but still dealing with her own like political nonsense and like weird violence from Cersei, and kind of fighting her own battle in there. And I love those different perspectives. I love when you get like the back-to-back chapters of cutting between those perspectives. That to me, that's always the most powerful storytelling that Martin does, is when you get basically one scene told to you from 3 different perspectives. He does it with that. He does it in some other big moments. And I just think it's so incredibly powerful. And I think those are the 3 right perspectives to tell is that you have somebody on Team Stannis, somebody on Team Lannister, and somebody who's kind of on Team Nobody because she doesn't want the Lannisters to win, but Cersei's like, oh, if Stannis wins, I'm going to have Ilyn Payne cut your head off, so, like, don't hope for that. So...
And her chapter also gives, just in general, that, like, beyond her specifically, but also more broadly, the perspective of, like, of people being caught in the crossfire. The idea that, again, as you know, comes up throughout these books, but, like, the idea that these kings are going to war and whatever, but also there are all of these other people whose lives are completely upended or ended ultimately by this.
Right.
Like, it's not.
It's really the continuation of the thread we talked about earlier with, like, yeah, Ned's death started this war, but it also broke Catelyn the person, and that's something we should confront and deal with. It's the same thing here. It's like, yes, this battle is going on, and that's important politically, and who's going to take the city, and how's that going to mean for the war, and yada, yada, yada. But also, like, all of these boys out there have moms and sisters and wives in here, and they're all terrified, and that's a real story, too, as real as anything else. And I love that this is a story that takes the time to give you those perspectives and to show you, you know, the worried women that fantasy and political series love to forget about. It
was also interesting, too, that Sansa has a moment where she's, like, calming the women in there.
My favorite.
And, yes, like, loved it. So great. Also, like, so sad. It's another one of those things where, like, you would have been good at this.
Yes.
You're not going to get to. But, like, juxtaposed against Cersei, who's so fucking bad at that component of it. And, like, interesting. I'm very curious to see how much of... I guess I only know show Marjorie, but I'm curious to see how much of that, like, her efficacy, her, like, how good she was on the show, at least in terms of dealing with, like, being of the people in some, as you know, as much as you can when you're redonkulously wealthy and like a fucking queen. But, like, you know, make it like the ways in which on the show they showed her kind of making those efforts. I'm curious whether that's going to be a thing in the book. But that was one of the things, as soon as we got to that little moment, that was one of the things that stood out to me, and kind of like the, like, larger big picture things of all of the threats, the things that Cersei fears. And I don't know. It's just, it's interesting. I also, I don't know if it was on the show or not that Cersei originally resisted the idea of having Joffrey set Sansa aside. And I'm curious, like, where, like, what that comes from. Like, if that's like part of her own if it's tied to her own bitterness at the way in which she was used by her father throughout her life, or if it's that, you know, her knowledge of how easily she can control Sansa, that she's like, I like this one. I can basically make her do whatever the fuck I want. I don't know. Or both, maybe. I'm not sure. But that was the thing that, a very small thing that stood out to me as interesting, because I did not recall it being a thing on the show.
Gotcha. I can't remember if it's a thing on the show, but I will say that I think if there is an impetus for that, it's simply that Sansa's going to stay exactly where she is, because if we lose her, the Starks are going to kill Jaime. At this point, Catelyn still has Jaime, so Cersei doesn't give a damn what Joffrey wants. She wants Jaime back, and that means Sansa's not moving an inch. I think... Again, this is not something that is appropriate to get into in this podcast, but I want to temper everyone's expectations for Marjorie.
Oh, no.
I remember this.
It's not that she's bad. She's just not in the books as much as she is on the show. No. So there's a lot of interesting stuff there. In the Tyrells throughout what they're doing. Very little of it is directly Marjorie. I think you will still enjoy all the Tyrell stuff, because it gives you everything that Marjorie gives you on the show in terms of, like, cool, sexy political things. And also,
the fact that the fact that Sansa gets the thing from she gets the thing from the guy. But the
I know exactly what you're talking about. I actually do.
Are we talking about the murderous hairnet?
Yeah,
murderous hairnet. Yeah, I mean, we don't know that yet. Without having seen the show, if you're just reading the book, all we know is that what's his name? the fool, former knight fool, who's
Dantos.
promised to rescue Dantos, yes, who has promised to help her escape, gives her this gift, which, like, we know also from having seen the show that, like, that is ultimately gonna, like, play a role in the assassination. But on the show, Olenna Tyrell is like a major player in the assassination, but she has not arrived in King's Landing yet.
Not yet. Just wait for my favorite chapter in the next book.
Great. Okay. But that to me, that's to this point about like tempering our expectations about what's going to happen with Marjorie and whatnot. That was a thing that I was like, oh, are a lot of my favorite Olenna Tyrell moments not actually Olenna Tyrell?
Oh, no, actually, I think more of them will be Olenna Tyrell.
Okay, good.
Or at least they'll be her and even bigger.
Perfect. Okay.
Having that knowledge that like the books diverge, or the show diverged from the books, kind of season 1 we knew was pretty faithful, and I think even season 2, from kind of knowing, like now having read the book, was pretty faithful as well. But I had this idea in my head that like knowing that things were going to start to diverge. So when that whole thing where it was like Roose Bolton's bastard was killed, I was like, was he really? Oh my god, this is great. Like it's different in the books. It's so much better. I love this. I love this. I love this. And then he's like not dead. And I was like, you got me. So that experience of like having in the back of my head that like maybe I have some foreknowledge, but second guessing everything because I know that things will be different. I think that should be fun. And the Marjorie thing was one that I knew because I remember that the actress whose names I'm forgetting right now, but
Natalie Dormer.
Natalie Dormer was a big reason why they expanded her role.
I mean, if I had Natalie Dormer, I would never let her leave my screen.
Right. I remember reading about that. So when they started mentioning her in this book, which she was Renly's queen, and we saw her like maybe one time and she had no lines, I was like, here it goes.
I can't say more because it just has to do with the next book, so I'm not letting myself say more on that.
Dang it. It's the next book that I know I have to read in the next 2 months, but we'll probably again wait until...
Everyone start tomorrow. The next one will probably be your favorite, so I promise we will get to have all relevant complaints about every book and every male character that we can't stand at the appropriate time.
At the appropriate time. All right. This is, I mean, that's like, I hope you know that this is like essentially what you have signed up for. It's like hold our hands through this. Now, children.
Listen,
what we're doing here.
I mean, I forced you guys to read 1,000-page long books. You bet your ass I know that comes with some responsibility for carrying you over the finish line.
I feel like, I don't know if you guys are going to agree with me here, but as much as I enjoyed reading this and I felt like there was a lot to keep my interest, by the end of the book, and I know we had a huge battle to end the book too, but kind of after I ended it and I was looking back, I was like, we didn't get very far. Like, say, I don't know, Renly died, which was important, but like I felt like Arya had a sidebar and then she just leaves Harrenhal and it's like, okay, Dany was off having visions and sidebars, and then you have the whole like Blackwater thing, but at the end of the day, like Stannis leaves like his, wounded and he doesn't have as many men and whatnot, but I don't know, it just felt like it was a lot of like ambling and getting things into position and not a lot of like very strong plot points. I don't know if you guys felt that way as well.
Yes, I don't have anything more to say than that, but yes, I agree. It was definitely, and like even now reflecting on it, I'm like, that's you pretty much said all the things, all the big things that happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I think at least part of it is intentional. I think the title is even like people are clashing, but like those clashes haven't come to their peak yet.
Right.
So I think that is true, but I don't necessarily have a problem with it. But that's kind of how I feel about everything. It's like, that's true, but it's also great. Which I recognize is, not a universal opinion.
I also, you mentioned when we started that the LSD visions that Dany was having is one of your favorite scenes in the book. So I'm very curious to hear.
I mean, that favorite was probably not even the right word. it's the one that you get the most out of on reread.
Right.
And so that's it's a gift that keeps on giving in that way. Like, even once you've read all 5 books and so you can figure out what a lot of those visions actually mean, like, there's still some that you can. And does that mean that they're coming in Winds of Winter? Or does it mean that they mean something we're not thinking of that already happened? Like that, I love all of that. She talks, some of the visions are things that we already know are coming. Dany sees a dead man with the head of a wolf in an iron crown, like holding a leg of lamb, like he's at a feast. So, like, we get a little red wedding foreshadowing there. She talks about a blue-eyed king who casts no shadow, who's holding a red sword, and that's Stannis. And there are a couple of others that by the end of the books that are currently published, you'll be like, oh, I know what that means now. And I don't know. I like playing with that and theorizing about that. That's fun for me. On first read, is it a bunch of meaningless LSD nonsense? Yes. And so you were allowed to be like, really? That's your favorite? Because, like, I get that that's nonsense.
Well, I realized that it was like super foreshadowing heavy because, with the 4. So I was more curious, like, how much of that is already resolved for you in your head, because even now reading it, having seen the show but reading for the first time, there was a lot of it that I was like, still, like, is this or is this that, or have we seen this yet? So I didn't know for book readers how much of that was already apparent.
Yeah, so if you've finished all the books, you definitely get more meaning out of a lot of what she sees there. Not everything. Not all of that is conclusive, but there's a lot of it that's in the books that is not at all in the show, or in the show in such a different way that you would never be able to tell that this is referring to that. So, like, some of these foreshadowing references are to characters who were cut completely from the show.
Okay.
And some of them are to characters who are just very different on the show than they are on the books. And some of them we don't know what the hell they are yet, and maybe we will by the end of all 7 books. So
I want to have a Sam's House of the Undying corner, like on the future episodes.
Oh,
the books where, like, we just like revisit this chapter and you talk about here's this thing from the House of Undying.
I love it.
Especially I almost called them triplets, but that's probably not the right word. I can't, it's try something, but they, like, she had let's
like
see.
child of 3 things.
Yes, yeah, like
all
she's
the
gonna
threes.
be like the betrayals were gonna be.
Oh yeah, the betrayal. So that, I mean, that's enjoyable in later books because Dany herself is like, so wait, do you think this is the second one or the third one? Those are great because both in and out of universe, like, we don't know what counts as a betrayal, what counts as for love, So I would say that those are actually, like, even more open to interpretation than, like, the kind of specific visions of, like, a guy with this kind of face and this kind of sigil did this thing. I think that the 3s and whatever they may be and who the 3 heads of the dragon are and all that kind of stuff is definitely still something that, like, everybody on Reddit is probably debating at this minute and all disagreeing with each other.
It's very exciting. It makes me feel the way that the season 4 final episode of Buffy where she had the dreams, like, that's what it makes me feel like, where she's having have all of these, like, spoiler pieces and you're trying to figure out what's, like, dream and means nothing and what's actually a spoiler for things to come.
Is that when she has the dream and it's like the bed and something about the dawn and you get the foreshadowing of dawn?
It's Restless is the name of the episode, right?
Yes. Right. So, like, that, like, that's exactly what this is like things that you don't know what they mean yet, but by the end you're like, oh, that is probably what that meant. So, like, yeah, that's a great comparison to this.
It was funny to have in this book because meanwhile you have Jojen Reed who shows up in this book as well, and he's at Winterfell and he's like giving his dreams, and he's like, the sea is coming to Winterfell, and everybody's scratching their head like, what could it mean? And you're like, come on.
Be more clear. Be more clear with your visions.
It's the
God, everybody's visions have to be metaphorical. Like, come on.
Right? Fuck. Can anybody have a hyper literal vision for once? And on that note, I think we are done for today. We could talk forever about all the other characters that we loved and hated and gave us all the feelings, but we got to end it somewhere, and this is where we're choosing to do it. Thank you again to Sam for being here to discuss this book with us and have all of the knowledge that we didn't have about this book that we also read. If you would like to share all of your thoughts and feelings about this book with us, you can find us at SnarkSquad.com, where there will be a post up about this episode, or you can sign up for a newsletter and join our Discord. You can also find us on Twitter at @Snark_squad. I am at Sweeney Says.
You can find me at My Name is Marinés.
And you can find me at Democracy Diva.
Thank you to Stefan Chin for the fancy theme music that is playing us out right now, and we will be back in your ears again next week. Bye!
Bye, guys.